The single red silk slipper, half buried in the cracked earth of the dry creek bed, was the first thing Arthur Bishop saw. It was a patch of impossible color in a world of brown dust and pale, sun-bleached grass. The embroidery was frayed, the sole worn through, but it was so profoundly out of place that he reined in his horse, a big roan gelding that shifted impatiently beneath him. He was a man who noticed things that were out of place. It was how a man stayed alive in the vast, quiet emptiness of the Wyoming Territory. He swung down from the saddle, his boot sinking into the fine powder. He nudged the slipper with his toe. It was small, impossibly delicate. A woman's shoe, but not the sturdy leather boot of a rancher's wife or daughter. This was something from a different world. He scanned the horizon, his gaze sweeping over the low hills and the shimmering heat that rose from the plains. There was nothing. No wagon, no rider, no sign of life. Just the wind and the endless sky. But his horse nickered, a low sound of unease, and tossed its head toward a cluster of sun-scorched junipers 50 yards away. Therefore, Arthur walked, his spurs making no sound in the soft dust. He found her there, curled in the sliver of shade the sparse trees offered. She was little more than a girl, her face smudged with dirt, her dark hair tangled and loose around her shoulders. She wore a simple tunic and trousers, the fabric torn and stained. One of her feet was bare. She didn't stir as he approached, and for a cold moment, he thought he was too late. He knelt, the leather of his chaps creaking, and saw the faint, shallow rise and fall of her chest. Her eyes opened when his shadow fell over her. They were dark and wide with a fear so deep it had burned past screaming into a silent, animal terror. She flinched away, trying to press herself into the hard earth. "Easy now," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble, unused to speaking to anyone but his horse and his 2 hands. He held up his hands, palms open. "I'm not going to hurt you." She said nothing. She was Chinese, he realized, her features fine-boned and distinct. He'd seen railroad workers in Cheyenne, and families who ran laundries in the rougher towns, but never one out here alone. It made no sense. He uncorked his canteen and held it out. She stared at it, her eyes fixed on the water as if it were a mirage. He set it on the ground and slid it toward her. Her hand, small and trembling, darted out to snatch it. She drank greedily, then coughed, water spilling down her chin. Getting her to his ranch was a slow, careful process. She wouldn't let him touch her, so he couldn't lift her onto his horse. Instead, he walked, leading the roan, and she followed a few paces behind, a silent shadow limping on one bare foot. The sun was brutal, a physical weight that pressed down on them. By the time the low-slung buildings of his homestead came into view, nestled in a dip of the plains that offered some protection from the wind, she was stumbling with every step. His 2 ranch hands, Walt and Davy, stopped their work mending a corral fence as he approached. Walt, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun and skepticism, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Davy, barely a man at 19, just stared. "Found her out by the dry fork," Arthur said, by way of explanation. He didn't offer any more, and they knew better than to ask. He gestured for the girl to follow him toward the main house, a sturdy clapboard structure he'd built with his own hands 10 years prior. He led her into the cool, dim interior. The main room served as kitchen, dining hall, and living space. It smelled of coffee, leather, and wood smoke. It was a man's space, functional and unadorned. He pointed to a chair at the long plank table. "Sit." She sat, perching on the very edge of the seat as if ready to bolt. He put a plate of cold beef and a chunk of dry bread in front of her. She ate it mechanically, her eyes never leaving him. When she was done, he showed her the small spare room at the back of the house. It was little more than a closet with a cot, but it was clean. He placed a bucket of water and a rag by the door. "You can stay here for now," he told her. "Rest up." She looked at him, and for the first time, her expression changed. The terror receded, replaced by a profound, bottomless weariness. She gave a small, jerky nod. He closed the door, leaving her in the quiet dark. For 2 days, she was a ghost in his house. He'd leave food outside her door, and later the plate would be empty. He heard her moving sometimes, the soft pad of her bare feet on the wooden floor, but he never saw her. Walt made his opinion known. "Ain't right, Arthur," he grumbled, leaning against the porch rail that evening. "A girl like that, alone. Spells trouble. Could have family or worse, a husband, looking for her. You don't need that kind of attention." "She was half dead," Arthur replied, not taking his eyes off the horizon where the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and purple. "What was I supposed to do? Leave her for the coyotes?" "Sometimes the coyotes are the simplest answer," Walt said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. He knew Arthur as well as any man. Arthur Bishop had a stubborn streak of decency that, in Walt's opinion, was bound to get him killed one day. On the third morning, a new smell filled the ranch house. It wasn't the familiar, slightly scorched scent of Arthur's coffee or the greasy aroma of fried salt pork. It was something else entirely. Something savory and complex, with a hint of wild herbs. Arthur followed the scent to the kitchen. She was standing at the cast-iron stove, her back to him. She had found a spare apron and tied it around her small frame. Her hair was neatly combed and tied back. She moved with a quiet efficiency, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon. On the counter, a mound of dough was rising under a damp cloth. She turned when she heard him, her body going rigid. But he didn't say anything. He just watched. She had taken their meager supplies, salt pork, flour, beans, a few withered onions from the root cellar, and was transforming them. She had found a patch of wild sage and thyme behind the bunkhouse and incorporated it into the stew. When Walt and Davy came in for breakfast, they stopped dead in the doorway, their mouths agape. The table was set. In the center was a steaming pot of stew, thick with meat and beans, fragrant with herbs. Beside it sat a plate of perfectly browned, fluffy biscuits. They ate in silence, a rare thing for the two boisterous hands. They ate, and then they ate some more. Walt, who had complained about Arthur's cooking for 5 years straight, cleaned his plate, wiped it with a biscuit, and then looked at the girl. "Much obliged, miss," he said, the word sounding rusty from disuse. She ducked her head in a small nod, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Her name, he learned later that day, was Mai. He asked her, and she whispered it so softly he had to lean in to hear. Mai. From that day on, the kitchen became her domain. She rose before the sun, and the scent of baking bread or simmering stew became the new signal for the start of the day. Their stores were limited, but she was endlessly resourceful. She started a small garden patch by the well, coaxing stubborn shoots of lettuce and radishes from the dry soil. She learned the ranch rhythms without a word being spoken, having hot coffee ready when they came in from the cold morning air, and a hearty meal waiting no matter how late they returned from a long day's ride. Word began to spread. Cowboys riding line for the bigger outfits to the north started to find excuses to pass by the Bishop Ranch around supper time. They'd heard rumors of the food. They would arrive, dusty and tired, and Mai would quietly set another plate or two at the table. She never spoke to them, but her cooking did. Men who lived on a diet of hardtack and bitter coffee would eat her meals with a kind of religious reverence. They left with full bellies and a look of wonder, leaving behind a sack of flour or a few tins of peaches as silent payment. Arthur watched it all with a growing sense of unease. He had taken her in out of pity, a feeling of simple duty to a fellow creature in distress. But pity was a thin, sterile thing. This was different. She was no longer a helpless victim. She was becoming the quiet, steady heart of his ranch. The mood in the bunkhouse was better, the work was done with more energy. Walt had stopped his grumbling, and young Davy followed Mai around with the devotion of a puppy. Arthur found himself looking forward to the end of the day, not just for the food, but for the sense of order and peace she brought to his chaotic, solitary world. He was becoming dependent on her, and that was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have for a very long time. The change was not lost on the world outside his ranch. The complication Walt had predicted arrived on a hot Tuesday in July, in the form of a portly cattle buyer from Cheyenne named Frank Sterling. Sterling was a man who measured the world in dollars and cents, and people in terms of their use to him. He came to haggle over the price of Arthur's yearlings, and the deal was concluded, as always, over the midday meal. Sterling took his seat at the table, his eye sweeping the room and landing on Mai as she brought the food from the stove. It was a simple but delicious meal, a savory pie with a flaky crust, filled with rabbit and wild vegetables, and a side of fresh greens from her garden. Sterling ate with gusto, complimenting the food loudly. "Bishop, you old dog," he boomed, wiping his greasy mouth with the back of his hand. "Where'd you find this little treasure? She cook like this all the time." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Mai is a guest here," he said, his voice flat. Sterling chuckled, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. "A guest, is she? A mighty useful guest. Must be saving you a fortune in wages. I hear fellas are riding 20 miles out of their way for a plate of her cooking." He winked at Walt. "You ought to hire her out. Charge by the head." Mai, who had been clearing the plates, froze. Her back was to them, but Arthur could see the tension in her small frame. "She is not for hire," Arthur said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. His voice was quiet, but it carried the chilling weight of a winter storm. "And she is not to be discussed as if she were a piece of livestock. You've concluded your business here, Sterling. You can see yourself out." Sterling's jovial expression vanished, replaced by a sneer. He had known Arthur for years as a quiet, reasonable man. This was new. He looked from Arthur's cold eyes to the silent Chinese girl and back again. A slow, ugly understanding dawned on his face. "Well, now," he said, pushing his chair back. "I see how it is. Getting mighty protective. Town's been wondering what a man like you is doing with one of them out here all alone. Looks like they were right to wonder." Before Arthur could move, Walt was on his feet. The older man was slow to anger, but when he was, it was a sight to behold. "Mr. Sterling," Walt said, his voice dangerously soft. "The boss asked you to leave. I suggest you do it now, before you find your horse has gone lame." Sterling's eyes flickered to Walt, then to Davy, who was also standing, his young face set in a hard line. The cattle buyer was a man of bluster, not action. He grunted, grabbing his hat from the peg by the door. "No need to get hostile. A man can't make an observation." He slammed the door behind him, and a moment later they heard the sound of his buggy rattling away at a fast clip. Silence descended on the room. It was broken by the small, sharp sound of a plate slipping from Mai's fingers and shattering on the floor. She stared at the broken pieces, her body trembling. Arthur knew that by nightfall, Sterling's version of this story, twisted and ugly, would be all over the nearest town. He had publicly defended her, and in doing so, had tied his fate, and his reputation, to hers. He did not yet know that the reason for her exile was far more dangerous than town gossip. That evening, a quietness settled over the ranch that had nothing to do with peace. The confrontation with Sterling had changed something, cracking the simple domestic shell they had built and letting the harsh realities of the world rush in. Walt and Davy were subdued, casting worried glances toward the main house. Inside, Arthur sat at the long plank table, staring into a cup of cold coffee. He found Mai in the kitchen, long after the evening meal was done. She was scrubbing the wooden countertop with a fierce, desperate energy, her knuckles white. The broken plate had been swept away, but the ghost of the afternoon's ugliness remained. "Mai," he said softly. She stopped scrubbing but didn't turn around. "I should go," she said, her voice small and tight. "I bring you trouble." "The trouble was Sterling's, not yours," he replied, moving to stand a few feet away. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "He's a man with a small mind and a big mouth. He will tell people," she whispered. "They will say bad things. About you. I've had bad things said about me before." Words don't break bones, but he knew it wasn't that simple. A man's reputation was a form of currency on the frontier. Without it, credit dried up, neighbors turned their backs, and trouble found you more easily. She finally turned to face him. In the dim lamplight, her face was pale, her eyes dark pools of misery. "It is more than words," she said, her English careful and precise. "There is a man. He will be looking for me." Arthur felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What man?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the small, embroidered silk pouch she always wore tucked into her sash. Her fingers went to it, tracing the stitched pattern. "My family, they arranged a marriage. To a man who works for the railroad. A foreman. His name is Jien. He is not a good man. He has power. He frightens people." She took a deep breath, the story pouring out of her in a quiet rush. Her father owned a small shop that supplied the railroad camps. Jen had offered to protect her father's business, to ensure he got the best contracts, in exchange for my. It was a business transaction. But she had seen Jen. She had seen the cruelty in his eyes, the way the other workers flinched from him. She refused the marriage. "My father," she said, her voice breaking, "he was afraid. Jen threatened him. Threatened our family. To save them, my father told me I was no longer his daughter. He gave me a few coins and told me to run. He said if I stayed, Jen would take me anyway, and then destroy them for my defiance." She pulled the silk pouch from her sash and opened it. Inside was not a coin or a jewel, but a simple, smooth stone from a riverbed and a tiny, folded piece of paper. "My mother gave me this. It is a blessing for safety." He looked at her then, and saw not a frightened girl, but a woman who had made an impossible choice. She had sacrificed her home, her family, everything she had ever known, to escape a fate she could not endure. His pity for her evaporated, replaced by a profound, aching respect. She hadn't been a victim he'd found in the dirt, she was a survivor. "This man, Jen," Arthur said, his voice level. "Does he know where you went?" "No. I ran for many days. I did not think. I just walked away from the tracks, into the hills. But the world was getting smaller. The railroad brought news, and telegraph lines carried whispers faster than any horse. Men like Sterling traveled between towns, carrying gossip like a contagion. If Jen was asking questions, it was only a matter of time before a description of a lone Chinese girl, taken in by a quiet rancher, reached his ears. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a name and a face. Arthur had a choice. He could send her away, put her on a wagon east or west, and wash his hands of the whole affair. It would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing. Or he could stand his ground, here on the piece of land he had fought for, and protect the woman who had, in a few short weeks, made it a home. He looked at her small, determined face, and knew it wasn't a choice at all. "You're not going anywhere," he said. The words were simple, but they landed in the quiet kitchen with the weight of a solemn vow. "This is your home now. Let him come." 3 months passed. The fierce heat of summer softened into the golden light of early autumn. The yearlings were fattened on the rich fall grass, and the ranch buzzed with the steady rhythm of work. A freighter passing through confirmed their fears. A railroad foreman named Jen had been in Cheyenne, asking about a runaway girl. But Arthur had been prepared. He had taken a long ride to the territorial capital and spent an afternoon with the U.S. Marshal, a man he knew from his early days in the territory. He didn't share all of my story, just enough. He spoke of threats, of a man with a bad reputation trying to intimidate a lone woman under his protection. The marshal, a man who respected property and disliked bullies, made a few notes. He sent a telegraph message down the line, a quiet inquiry into Jen's business dealings. It was a small thing, but on the frontier, the interest of federal law was often enough to make a man reconsider his plans. They heard nothing more of Jen. The change on the ranch was palpable. Mai was no longer a silent presence. She moved with a quiet confidence, her voice now heard giving instructions to Davy about the garden or bargaining in steady English with a traveling peddler for spices and cloth. She had replaced her worn tunic with sturdy dresses sewn from calico, and the ruined silk slipper was a distant memory, supplanted by the scuffed leather boots Arthur had bought for her in town. Her cooking had become a local legend. The bunkhouse table was often crowded with neighbors or passing riders, their talk and laughter filling the room. The Bishop Ranch was no longer just a patch of land with some cattle, it was a place of welcome, a point of light in the vast landscape. Mai was the center of it, the source of its warmth. One cool evening, Arthur found her by the corral, watching the horses as they settled for the night. The setting sun bathed the plains in a soft, rosy glow. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, a language they had perfected. "Walt says we'll have a good price for the cattle this year," he said finally. "Best in a long time." "That is good," she replied, her gaze on the horses. "You have worked hard." "We've worked hard," he corrected her gently. He looked at her, at the way the light caught the side of her face. He remembered the terrified, starved girl he had found by the creek. And he looked at the capable, courageous woman who stood beside him now. He had thought he was offering her shelter, a temporary reprieve from the harshness of the world. He had been wrong. He had been the one living in a shell, a house that was just a building, his life a routine of work and survival. She had broken it open. She had filled it with the scent of baking bread, the sounds of a garden growing, the quiet dignity of her own strength. He hadn't rescued her. In the end, they had built this life, this home, together. The knowledge settled in his chest, not with a crash, but as a quiet, certain truth, as solid and enduring as the land itself. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.